I'm Denise.
She's a non-fiction editor. And I'm Louise.
She's a fiction editor. And together,
we're the Editing Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Editing Podcast. So this time around, we're delighted to welcome our special guest, Crystal Shelley, a copy editor, proofreader and sensitivity reader who works with self-publishing fiction authors.
That's right. So Crystal also practices as a licensed clinical social worker, and she unites her love of language and social justice by providing editorial services with a focus on conscious language and representation. And that's exactly what we're going to be picking her brains about today. So hello, Crystal.
Hi.
It's so lovely to have you here.
I know. I'm so excited to be here. I'm such a big fan of your podcast, so thank you.
Oh, well, you're very
lovely.
welcome.
That's lovely, Crystal. Thank you. Crystal, I think we should start right at the very beginning for our listeners. Could you explain to them what sensitivity reading is?
Yes. So sensitivity reading is a service that evaluates the representation of identities or experiences, usually when a writer doesn't have those identities or experiences, but they're writing about them. So, for example, like if a non-disabled writer writes a character who's disabled, then they might hire a sensitivity reader with that disability to get feedback on their portrayal.
So what types of topics do people read for when they're sensitivity reading, Crystal?
Most of the time, people will read for demographic categories like race, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. Usually sensitivity reads are recommended when a writer is writing about marginalized identities that they don't share. Mm-hmm. But it can be also outside of demographic categories, like experiences that might be hard to really capture if you haven't been through them before, like being adopted or being a caregiver. Or some sensitivity readers read for groups with strong cultures that are outside of ethnic groups, like military culture or fandom culture. So sensitivity readers can cover a vast number of topics.
I have to say that's a lot broader than I realised.
Yeah, that is really broad. So I'm assuming
then
so
many options.
Yeah, you can't just assume that a sensitivity reader would be suitable for everything. So what topics do you read for, Crystal?
I read for Chinese and Taiwanese culture, as well as the experiences of being Asian American, women's issues, ageism, Alzheimer's and dementia, and hospice, as well as online gaming culture. So some of those, you can probably guess, are based on my personal identities, but some of them are based on my professional experiences as a social worker. So again, very broad categories, but what I read for is going to be very different from what someone else reads for.
And that's really good for someone to think about, actually, if a listener's thinking, if they're perhaps an editor already and they're thinking about moving into this field, they might not have considered using their background experiences, their career experiences. That there is opportunities there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what can you tell us a little bit about the sensitivity reading process and what that looks like?
Yeah, so I can only speak for my own process, but I think it's pretty similar across the board, and I compare it to the freelance editing process. They look pretty similar. And so usually a writer will decide that they need a sensitivity reader. So they'll search for one who reads for the topic that they need, and then they'll contact them. For me, usually people find me through my website or on social media. So I list what topics I read for, and they can contact me if it seems like, if I read for something they need. And so they send me a message and we figure out if I'm going to be the right fit. And usually that's based on the topic that they need the sensitivity read for, because really the sensitivity reader should match the identities or experiences as closely as possible. And so we'll talk and we'll figure out if it's a right fit based on that topic and the price and the timeline. And if so, then they'll hire me. I'll do the sensitivity read of the manuscript, and then I'll offer feedback.
Yeah. And does that come in report form or? Or might you do it over the phone? Or again, is that a personal thing?
Yeah, every sensitivity reader is going to have their own process, but I think it's from those I've talked to, it sounds like a lot of us have a similar format of with our feedback. So I do both a sensitivity reading report and manuscript comments. So I don't make direct changes to the manuscript, but yeah. So in the sensitivity reading report, I give feedback at the story level. So I'll usually, because I'm usually doing it for fiction, so I'm looking at the plot, the characters, the settings, and the narrative lens, but through the lens of the topic that I'm reading for. And then, so that I summarize in a report to them. And then in the manuscript comments, I'll offer feedback on the words and the language that they use in their manuscript, and offer suggestions or alternatives, or tell them, you got this spot on, so great job.
Yeah.
Right. And Crystal, can I ask, at what point in the writing and editing process would you advise is the best point to have a sensitivity reader look at material, or does that depend on what's being written?
Yeah, I mean, I recommend really as soon as the writer knows that they might need a sensitivity reader, it's good to start that process, because if the writer goes through a developmental edit and then a copy edit and hopefully not a proofread, and then they hire a sensitivity reader, and that reader offers feedback that says they need to make these sweeping changes and revisions to their manuscript, then that author has potentially spent all that time, that money, only to have to undo it and redo it. So really, as soon as the writer has an idea, maybe they do beta reading, maybe a developmental editor, because the writer may not think that they need a sensitivity read. So
that's what I was about to ask is, does it must happen, I would imagine, particularly perhaps with independent authors who are self-publishing, where they either have no idea that such a thing exists, or they haven't looked at their own writing through that lens, and it's only when somebody outside, perhaps it might even be a copy editor, is the first person that's looked at it, and then they're told that they might need one. Do you find most people are receptive to that?
And the authors I've worked with, I mean, it's been a mix. I mean, they've all been receptive to it, but I've had authors say, I want to make sure that I got this representation right, which is why I want to hire you. Or they said, oh, this person, this editor, or this friend of mine read my manuscript and they recommended it. Or they're being traditionally published, and the publisher is the one who has asked that they get a sensitivity read. Right. So it really depends, but I've been fortunate to work with a lot of writers who have been open to the idea and open to the feedback.
And that's really interesting. I'm also wondering if a book or a piece of writing might need multiple sensitivity reads, if there's possibly a situation where one sensitivity reader can't address all the potential issues. Have you come across that situation at all?
Yeah, so I mean, really, because like I talked about, sensitivity reads can be done for so many different topics and identities. Manuscripts can absolutely benefit from multiple sensitivity readers who can cover all the bases, or sometimes, especially when a topic is such a central and integral part to a plot or the story, then some writers may want to hire multiple sensitivity readers who read for the same topic, but that way they can get different perspectives on how they're handling it.
Right. And if you've got multiple characters with different identities, maybe some of them marginalized, maybe some of them not, but if it's quite a complex narrative, that might be essential. One can imagine. I mean, otherwise it could be just a job half done, I guess. You know, like say
Right.
if you had if you were reading for sensitivity with in relation to a character with the characteristics that you offer the read for, but there's other characters in the books who have very different identities, then you're do you know what I mean? You're going to be kind of like, it's going to be half of the job.
Right. Yeah. So there have been times where when writers have approached me, they've told me what they're wanting me to read for. And depending on that conversation, sometimes I'll say, yes, I can do that.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you have some other identities, or, not that I've really had this happen, but I've kind of seen it before where they may approach me to read. I read for Chinese and Taiwanese culture, but they may have characters who are Korean or Japanese or Vietnamese, and I have to be explicit, like, okay, I can read for specific Chinese culture, but not for these other ones. So
and maybe that character's a woman, but that's only half the story. So and oh, Denise, sorry, I heard you. Did you want to come in?
I took a breath. I was going to say something. Well, I was just going to say that actually could get pretty expensive for an author, couldn't it? You know, if you're adding in potentially multiple sensitivity reads for a book, and they've already got to factor in perhaps several different editing rounds depending on what sort of intervention their book reads requires. So I suppose that's something that a writer should really be thinking about quite early in the process, about just the fact of having to budget for something like this as well.
Right. Yeah. Depending on how many readers they need to hire, then that definitely would be a consideration. And there are readers who may be able to cover multiple topics. I think, of course, that would be nice. But and so writers have to prioritize. Maybe there's this main character, and that's the one they need the sensitivity read for. Of course, if they have supporting characters that play a role, they may still want to consider that, but depending on time and budget. So writers just have to really think about what their priorities are and how they want to continue in that process.
That's the same with all editing, isn't it? I think that's one of the biggest challenges for the independent author. It's we've got a budget, for a lot, that it's not a bottomless pit, and they have to make choices about where that investment's going to be. Because, but I do sort of see this it is essential that this comes earlier rather than later in the process. Otherwise, as you said, I mean, you could just end up investing huge amounts of money in line work and then having to undo it all because it's not written in a way that's sensitive to those identities.
Right. And that's why I like to talk to even other editors who aren't necessarily doing sensitivity reading, but they're developmental editors or line editors who and encouraging them to be on the lookout for potential representation concerns and to say something to the author and to say, hey, I noticed that this is a big part of your story. Have you, are you of this identity? Have you considered or heard of a sensitivity read? And really all of us, I think, can play a part in that process of educating writers and telling them about this service, and hopefully having them start it earlier rather than later.
I think that's a really good point about raising awareness. Sorry, Louise.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, I think it's a really good point about raising awareness, because I think a lot of writers don't know about this and are maybe reluctant to perhaps, or they either write about characters and identities that they're not familiar with and don't think anything of it, or alternatively they're reluctant to write about characters that they don't, and identities they don't have experience of, in case they cause offence, and they're maybe not aware that this is an option that's open to them.
And I think a lot of people don't even necessarily, coming back to that awareness thing, realize that this kind of editorial service is available.
Yeah.
I mean, I think people are starting, certainly there's been lots more talk within our industry in the last few years about representation and identity, but we're in the world of words. This is our job to think about this stuff. And yes, it's been much more public recently, but very recently, I think, are people really starting to think very, very, very much more carefully than they have done in the past about this kind of thing. And so there may be authors in the past, particularly, who just weren't aware that this was and that this kind of service was available to help them make the very best and representative characters in their books that they can. So,
Right.
Crystal, how do you become a sensitivity reader?
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, there's no specific training to becoming a sensitivity reader. Really, anyone can offer this service. And it's important to keep in mind that many sensitivity readers are not editors. There are many who are, and there are many editors who do offer this service, but not everyone is. Some are passionate readers who have certain identities and they want to help writers get this right. So if someone wants to become a sensitivity reader, they would want to identify what topics they can read for, what they feel like they can speak to as far as accuracy and representation, and then determine what their process is as far as engaging clients, doing the actual read and offering that feedback, and setting their price, marketing themselves, much like what a freelance editor would have to do.
Yeah.
Crystal, can I just go on to think a little bit about the concerns that some authors might have about hiring and working with a sensitivity reader, because they may be worried or concerned about feeling that they're being censored, or that they might have their book pulled. So how do you go about addressing those concerns?
Yes, that's a great question, because that is the biggest barrier I see to writers engaging sensitivity readers, is this idea that it's censorship. Now, I'd like to frame it as, sensitivity readers are there to offer feedback, just as beta readers and editors do. So writers have full control over what they do with that feedback. They can make changes, or they can choose to completely ignore it. And the sensitivity reader can't force a writer to make a change. But there are times where publishers will choose to pull a book or cancel a contract because of representation concerns and then potential backlash. So it's a financial decision on their part. So some people may see that as cancel culture or censorship, but a writer can still find other avenues of publishing, including self-publishing. So it's a very fraught and controversial topic because of these reasons. But I think that, it's good for writers to consider what a sensitivity reader is saying and why they're making the recommendations they are. Because even if the writer doesn't see an issue with how they've presented something, that doesn't mean it's not harmful.
And that comes back to, like, who are you writing for? I mean, there will be some authors who think, I'm writing this and I'm writing it for me, and I don't care what anybody else thinks. But actually, a lot of authors want to sell books, and that means thinking about how their readers are going to feel, even if it's just some of their readers. And so that's why I really like the fact that you're talking about this to people like us, because it's that awareness thing. It's about, because it may be that a lot of people feel hesitation because they don't understand enough about it. They don't understand what they're thinking, it can make them feel defensive, rather than them seeing this as an opportunity. To work with a sensitivity reader means opening your mind a bit, and maybe sort of trying to see something through someone else's lens. Given that you've chosen to write about a character with that lens, it's the least you can do.
That's a great way to put it.
Crystal, you mentioned that a lot of the sensitivity reading you do is for fiction, and Louise is a fiction editor but I only work on non-fiction. And do you feel that there's a place for sensitivity reading in non-fiction too?
I do. I don't have as much experience in that realm, but sensitivity reading can be used for any type of writing where someone is writing outside their identities. So in memoirs, this can look like assessing the narrative lens or how the writer discusses other groups.
Yeah.
Or I've done sensitivity reading for textbooks to evaluate whether harmful language was used in relation to a topic that I read for, such as, you know, when textbooks have their like case studies. And I think a lot of textbook providers are trying to be more diverse and inclusive in their examples. But depending on who's writing it, there could be potential harmful language use or stereotypes. So I think there's a place for it really with any type of language and writing.
Yeah, I work, that's a really good point. I work a lot in ELT, English language teaching materials. I work in a lot of textbooks and workbooks and things like that. And there's a lot of discussion around equality and diversity and inclusion. And, you know, even at the copy edit stage, you're quite often having to flag up issues. And there's like you say, in terms of representation of different cultures and, you know, family setups and things like that. But very often that is dictated to by the market that these are being written for. And very often, if you're working on a book that's destined for, you know, a Middle Eastern market, there'll be quite a lot of restrictions on what you can and can't include because of the cultural and religious viewpoints in those countries. So the publishers have to be very careful about those sorts of things. So there is a big crossover there with, you know, sensitivity and culture and you know, diversity and inclusion, that you have. It's not just about what's in the book, but who's receiving it and who's going to be using it at the other end. And the bottom line is, will it sell? Will it be adopted by the ministries in these countries? You know, because if it doesn't reflect their lived experiences, they won't take them on.
Denise, can I ask you something? Do you know if any of the publishers you worked for created like different versions? So you might have a textbook that's designed to do X, and there'll be a version for the Middle Eastern market, and then a version for the main, you know, European. I've
worked on books where it's you know, it's a mainstream publisher and it's one of their big sellers, but it's being adapted for a specific market. So they will either remove materials or include materials, or, you know, maybe shift the focus of well, obviously a lot of the, you know, they might change the photography in it and the artwork and that sort of thing. And you know, things maybe have to be excluded, like dice games and stuff like that, because that's gambling. So you can't have that sort of thing. But yeah, adaptation's a big thing. That killed the conversation.
So my next question. Yeah, well, I want to talk to Crystal again. So there you
Carry on.
So Crystal, can you give listeners any tips about how authors could go about finding sensitivity readers? I mean, what kind of things should they be searching for? And you know, obviously they can go to Google, but it maybe it's the search terms and or maybe there are directories. Anyway, I'll go.
Yeah, there are some directories. I haven't found too many out there, but they do exist. So there's the Editors of Color database, which is, you know, it's only for, or only has editors who of color, as the name implies. But there is
it's a great name. That's what it says on the tin.
There's a filter where someone can search for a sensitivity reader specifically, because, you know, like I, as someone in the database, can choose what services I provide, and then it can filter by that. There also, through the EFA, the Editorial Freelancers Association, there is kind of a similar thing where freelancers can choose that they do sensitivity reading. So someone who's looking for a sensitivity reader can search the EFA database and filter by that. I'm also part of a Facebook group called Binders Full of Sensitivity Readers, where a writer can actually submit a request for a sensitivity reader through a
All
Google
right.
form that they have, and then it gets sent to its members, which it has a very large member base. So that can capture a lot of people. But honestly, like you said, a Google search can yield
Yeah.
great results. Often, if you just search, sensitivity read and topic,
Mhm.
then and the topic you're looking for, then that'll pop up with individuals' websites oftentimes.
And Crystal, when somebody maybe shortlists a few sensitivity readers that they've either found through Mr. Google or through one of the directories, are there any key questions that you would advise them to ask the sensitivity readers? Are there any sort of things that they really need to make sure they've established with them? What sort of conversations do you have with your prospective clients?
I think the biggest question is that idea of being the right fit. Just because a lot of times going into it, writers may have a very vague idea of what a sensitivity reader is and what they can do, or they may not understand that some identities are not interchangeable. And so having the conversation about what they're looking for, what the manuscript contains, and being upfront about that so that the sensitivity reader can really suss out whether they will be the right person who can read for those topics. And I would caution writers with, if they talk to someone and they say that they can represent an entire group or a demographic, or that they'll catch everything. I mean, I don't know that people actually say that, but it's a misconception that some people have going into that process of, oh, if I hire a sensitivity reader, then they'll be able to sign off on my project. That means no one can get offended by it or will criticize it.
Yes.
And so I would be, just beware of over promising by sensitivity readers. Again, I don't know that that actually happens, but I think there might be people out there who feel that they can speak for entire groups, which isn't.
It's tempting, isn't it? But I can see how that might happen, because I think sometimes, you do, like I could say, well, I'm a woman and I've read such and such, but that doesn't mean that I represent all white women or all white women or all white British women, because people are different. And so I think that's a really good point, that we do have to be careful about the degree to which we make promises about representing people, because there are always going to be limitations with it.
Yeah. I think it's also interesting, that idea of somebody, a writer perhaps thinking that if they hire a sensitivity reader, then that's
job done.
It's a box ticked, isn't it? You know, and
phew, that's all right. Crystal sorted it all out.
Yeah.
Nobody will shout at me.
Right. That is a very big misconception out there. And honestly, that is why I think some writers do hire sensitivity readers, is to be able to say, okay, I've checked that box. I can move on and my story's good. The ideal reason why I hope writers hire sensitivity readers is to try to get that representation right. But I think there are times where it's just like, okay, I've done my due diligence and can publish this now.
Like a proofread, like, oh, it's been through a proofread, so it's bound to be perfect now. And actually, that's
not always the case.
Yeah, but a proofreader will do their best to find everything, but we're human beings, aren't we? And so ultimately the responsibility does always still lie with the author. And
do you think people should only write what they know?
That's a great question. I am laughing because I actually wrote a 2-part blog post about this.
Oh, did you? Right.
I did, yeah. Because there's no right answer, but I think in there I specifically say there's the advice of write what you know, but what does that look like when it comes to identities? So I don't think that anyone should be told that they should never write outside their identities, write what they don't know, because it can be done right and it can be done well. But there's a lot of work that has to be done to get it right when you're a writer who's writing about marginalized identities that you don't share. Like there are a lot of questions there, particularly, you know, why do you want to tell this story? Why do you feel like it is yours to tell? Are there other options that may serve the same purpose without potentially, you know, treading into scary waters? But so I'm not going to say no, you should never do it, but there's also the Own Voices movement that shows the power of when marginalized writers write characters who share their identities and what that looks like, and how empowering and validating that can be. So
there's a balance there, isn't it? I was at a seminar, a lecture a couple of years ago. It was part of the Norwich Arts Festival thing, and somebody in the audience asked the commentator and journalist and author Tom Shakespeare, who has a wheelchair, who's in a wheelchair, and he was asked that very question, and his response was pretty much the same. He would never ever tell anybody that they shouldn't write about achondroplasia, which he has, or about being in a wheelchair, just because that's not part of their identity. But he said, for goodness sake, come speak to someone like me first. Just ask me, you know, just so that have the decency to at least learn and find out, rather than hashing it. And I think that sort of from a it's just, you know, it's just common. It starts with courtesy.
I think sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's a sort of tangential thing, but Stephen King says a similar thing about writing about murder and stuff like that. He said, well, I've never murdered somebody, but I've done my research, you know, so if you want to put it across
hopefully
in a
not practical
way, no, he hasn't taken out, you know, done lessons or whatever, but, you know, if you want to get it across in an authentic way, you need to do your research, don't you?
Yeah, you really do.
And I think it's even more challenging, especially with with writing about marginalized identities, because writers can do all the research they can about culture and experience, but unless someone's actually been in those shoes and experienced the systemic policies and discrimination and things like that,
how it feels. How it feels. That's the difference between reading a textbook and actually, but I guess that's sort of it. I know that I think it was David Baldacci, the thriller writer, said the same thing. Like, he always goes and he doesn't just like read books about when he's trying to find out about police procedure. He goes and talks to police officers so that he can understand how it feels to be an FBI agent or whatever. And obviously that's not as serious, because you're talking about maybe the difference between writing an authentic story and an inauthentic one. Whereas what we're talking about here is that plus harm, the potential of harm. But it is still essentially boiling down to that idea of how does it feel? How does it feel? And that's what I think that someone who does offers a service you offer can help an author bridge that gap.
But yeah, I mean, it is so important, I think, especially as editors, and that's why. So I did an ACES presentation a few weeks ago, and originally the prompt was like, oh, just we want it to be about sensitivity reading, but it was up to me what direction it would go in. So I consciously chose to make half of it about sensitivity reading and the other half of it about just how all editors can have these types of conversations. Because even Denise, your example, like with Scottish language and culture, even if you're not doing a sensitivity read, you are still someone who is an expert on that. So if you saw inauthentic representations, I don't know what word that was, but
inauthenticity, you nearly had it. It just kind of got lost.
But like, you as a human being can offer feedback to your writers when you're editing, if that's the realm it falls into, and you notice that, because I see all of us as preliminary readers. So if we see it, someone else is going to see it. So we may as well catch it before publication.
Yeah.
And that way the writers can.
That's a really good point, isn't it? Because all editors can be, I don't know what it is to be Taiwanese, but I might have an idea that something's potentially offensive. So I could say to someone, maybe you want to check out Crystal, or or whatever identity was in question. There's nothing to stop any editor taking on that preliminary role. I think that's a really good way of putting it.
I think for some editors that I've talked to or seen them talking about, I think there can be a struggle of what's my role? Should I stay in my lane? What am I being paid for? And what should I be doing versus if I step outside of this, am I going to upset the client? Am I going to offend them? Are they not going to want to work with me anymore? Which I think they're valid concerns. At the same time, it's, what is my due diligence as a language expert that the writer is turning to for feedback to say something if I notice something that could potentially harm readers or damage the writer's reputation or their financial viability. So it's all,
and it's part of an editor's, I guess, their journey, the journey that we all have to learn of learning to query well, isn't it? And I mean, that's just that crosses the whole board. That thing of how do I convey this concern I have in a way that doesn't make me feel like that isn't going to make them feel like they're being ticked off or patronized or attacked, because that's the surest way to stop someone thinking about the thing you want to think about them to think about if you come across as a bit grumpy.
There's a big difference between saying you're racist because you said this versus you may want to consider how readers may.
Exactly. Yeah.
Crystal, what was the name of that Facebook group? I need to put that in the show notes.
Binders full of sensitivity readers. It's a play on, I think it was when Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012. And he made I'm pretty sure it was Mitt Romney, when he made a comment that was lambasted.
Oh, right.
But he had binders full of women, I think.
Oh gosh, really?
Yeah, so
that's a bit icky.
I don't think it was meant in a bad, I think
it was
isn't it? It often isn't. But
but yuck.
Yes, it was Mitt Romney in 2012 in a debate. It said he used a phrase in response to a question about pay equity, referring to ring binders with resumes of female job applicants. But he said he had binders full of women. So it spawned a lot of offshoots and parodies. So it's binders full of sensitivity readers.
So I'm going to just find that now so I can put a link in. Oh my God.
Yeah.
When you type in binders into Facebook, the first thing it comes up with is binders full of women.
That's hilarious.
It's actually only sensitivity readers who are of marginalized genders. So it's only women, only trans folks, only non-binary. Not that I don't know that it would matter to writers that that's the case, but so basically no cisgender men are part of that group.
Right.
Okay then.
Crystal, I think we've covered a lot of ground here actually. I've really it's made me think an awful lot more about the breadth and depth of sensitivity reading, about just how much potentially is involved in it. So thank you so much for that. It's been really lovely to have you on the podcast.
It really has. I feel like I've learned so much, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface. But it's a really, really good surface to scratch. And maybe you can come back another time and we can dig into some of the nitty gritty a bit more. So
I would love to.
That would be great. So where can people get in touch with you?
Yes, so my website is rabbitwiththeredpen.com. And again, on there, I list what topics I read for as far as sensitivity reading goes, and it's got my email and contact information. I am on Twitter and Instagram as well, @RedPenRabbit.
I think that's a lovely name. Yeah,
it is, isn't
Thank
it?
you.
Yeah. Where does it come from? Is there a story behind it?
Yeah, so when I started my freelance business, I had no idea what to call it, but I knew I wanted, or I didn't know right off the bat, but as I was thinking about names and logos and branding, I knew that I wanted to make my logo a rabbit holding a red pen because the rabbit is my Chinese zodiac,
All
and
right.
it's how I've
Oh,
always represented myself. Like when I was a kid, I would draw a rabbit to represent myself.
yeah.
Oh,
So I was like, oh, I want to make that my logo. And it just kept sticking with me, like that idea of a rabbit with a red pen. And I'm like, I will just make that my name. And it's true to myself. And it's a little bit of editing, a little bit of my culture. And there we
I
go.
love
that's
brand names
great.
with great,
Yeah,
fantastic stories like that, and so personal as well. That's really brilliant.
that's lovely.
Thank you.
Great. So that's it for this week. Thanks very much for listening to the Editing Podcast. You can rate, review, and subscribe to us via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you prefer. She's been Louise.
And she's been Denise, and she's been Crystal. Thanks so much. Join us again soon.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.